Hello YouTube. Tamriel is full of interesting races, cultures and countries, with many of them being extinct now, unfortunately. From the Lilmuthid Foxmen of Blackmarsh, a race a bit like the Khajiit except foxes, to the Orma humans, humans born without eyes, to large intelligent slugs like the Slode. Now, one of the cultures that we haven't talked about are the Elves of Blackmarsh, as there were several groups of elves living in the swamps of Blackmarsh during Tamriel's history, and today we'll explore them in this video after the intro. So, the Elves of the Swamp. Now, right at the start, these elves are not a separate race such as the Wood Elves and the Sea Elves. Rather, they are exile groups of other races of elf who at some point in time lived in the swamps of Blackmarsh for one reason or another, getting their own distinct cultures and histories over the years. Now, the groups that we'll talk about are the so-called Barsaebic Ayleids, Ayleids who lived in the swamps of Blackmarsh, and the Cantemiric Velothi, an offshoot of the Chimera, the predecessor race to the Dunmer before they got their ashen skins, who also lived in Blackmarsh. You see, long ago in the Meretic era, after the first elves, the Aldmer with a D instead of a T, had landed on the Somerset Isles after fleeing their own doomed homeland of Aldmuris, they founded a new civilization on the Somerset Isles. Now, this civilization on the Somerset Isles would not be the only elven civilization in Tamriel, as in the subsequent centuries, offshoots of this new civilization would travel all across Tamriel and found new civilizations like the Ayleid Empire in the Heartland, the Snow Elf Kingdom in Skyrim and the Durrani Elves in High Rock. Most of these offshoots over the years would evolve into their own races, or at least subcultures with their own lands and history. Now, another offshoot of these elves on the Somerset Isles were the elves who would colonize much of Morrowind. These elves, over the years, would evolve into the golden-skinned Chimera elves. They find their origins in a religious dispute in this ancient civilization on the Somerset Isles. You see, a group of ancient elves abandoned the traditional Altmeri religion and rather adopted worship of the three so-called good Daedra, being Boethia, Azura and Mephala. This religious descent movement was led by the prophet Veloth, who spoke on behalf of these good Daedra and was thus called the Velothi descent movement. Now, I'm oversimplifying a part of the history a little bit, but what you need to know is that the rulers of the Somerset Isles weren't particularly happy with this religious schism, so they outlawed these new teachings, and each follower of the prophet Veloth was threatened with exile if they did not abandon this new theology. This then led to the Great Exodus, where those who decided to stick with Veloth and his teachings chose exile, as the prophet Veloth led them out of the Somerset Isles on a journey to eastern Tamriel. He led his people across the continent towards the east, guided by the three Daedra that they worshipped, and eventually he and his followers would come to the land which would later be called Morrowind and make it their new home, where they would eventually evolve into the golden-skinned Chimera, and then later, after the War of the First Council with the Dwemer, they became the Dunmer, so the ashen-skinned Dark Elves. However, according to ancient legends of the Chimera, along the way to Morrowind, Veloth and his followers were ambushed by the followers of the old Altmeri religion, specifically the god Trinemac, who tried to stop them in their journey to the east. It's said in these legends that the ensuing fight with them was epic and involved the gods themselves, but was also extremely chaotic, leading to the group of exiles being split into three, losing each other along the way. It's said that one group, which Veloth was a part of, then followed Azura and they were led to the province of Morrowind. One group followed Boethia and was taken into oblivion, and one group, the group that followed Mephala, was led to the southeast, to the coast of Blackmarsh, as according to Chimera legends, Mephala was the only one among the so-called good Daedra who did not fear the histories of Blackmarsh and the Argonians, and thus the people who followed her were led there to find their new place and probably colonize it from the histories and the Argonians. A popular theory is then that these Chimera who followed Mephala rather than Azura or Boethia after the battle with Trinemac and his followers became the so-called Cantemiric Velothi, a Chimera who lived not in modern-day Morrowind, then called Resdain, but who lived on the coasts of Blackmarsh. Now, it's a little bit important to note here that this is all a legend and thus extremely unreliable, as multiple religious aspects of this story, especially things considering Trinemac and Malakath, which feature heavily in this story, but which I skipped over because it's not super relevant for what we're talking about now, is contradicted by at least 2 other sources. However, it's the only source that we have that actually tells a possible origin story for the Cantemiric Velothi. Hence why I tell you this version of events, because it lines up perfectly with what we know of these swamp-dwelling Chimer before their presumed extinction, as Mephala led this group of Chimer to the southeast, and from the Pocket Guide to the Empire we learn that the Cantemiric Velothi used to live on the coasts of northeastern Blackmarsh, between Archon, Arnesia and Thorn. Here they founded their own civilization, separate from the Chimer of Morrowind, and they had their own isolated history. And this all lines up perfectly with a group of Chimer being led by Mephala to this area. Now, while the Chimer of Morrowind would develop a quite thriving civilization, forming themselves into the great houses of Morrowind, colonizing the entire province, warring with the Dwemer and so on, Morrowind history, it seems that the Cantemiric Velothi developed themselves far slower, staying relatively tribal in their way of life, according to the Pocket Guide to the Empire, who specifically calls them tribes. Now, while we know very little about their actual civilization before they went extinct, most likely due to the Knahaten flu, the disease which wiped out all non-Argonian races in Blackmarsh and thus likely the Cantemiric Velothi as well, we do know that the Chimer and later the Dunmer that were exiled from Morrowind seeking refuge would sometimes travel southeast to join the Cantemiric Velothi civilization, as we know that both Dunmer refugees and former prisoners joined their ranks. And if it's true that Chimery legends provide an accurate origin story for these elves, we can be pretty sure that Mephala held a great significance to their culture, like Azura did for the Dunmer in Morrowind. And we can also be pretty sure that they were the founders of cities like Archon and Thorn in Blackmarsh, and that they had some territorial overlap with the Lilmothid, or Foxmen of Blackmarsh, also before they went extinct, meaning that they often probably interacted with them, although there's no surviving records of that. And you need to keep in mind that the entire origin story may just be unreliable legend, and they may just have been exiles from Morrowind that traveled south and made their own civilization. That's very much possible, and that's the speculation given by Imperial scholars in universe. Now, that having been said, that's the precious little that we know of the Cantemiric Velothi. We literally know nothing of their civilization, we just know that they exist. They've existed in the lore since Oblivion, but we just don't know anything more. Now, talking about the other group of swamp elves that we know about, the Barsaebic Ayleids, they actually have a very similar origin story in a way to the Cantemiric Velothi. You see, as we talked about in my video on the Ayleid Empire, near the end of the Meretic era and in the beginning of the First Era, the Ayleid Empire in the heartlands of Tamriel was embroiled in a long-lasting civil conflict called the Narfinsel Schism. Now, the Ayleid Empire at the time was never a truly unified empire, rather it was a collection of cooperating independent kingdoms, and these kingdoms were religiously split between Aedra-worshipping kingdoms and Daedra-worshipping kingdoms, or kingdoms where Daedra were legal to worship. The Narfinsel Schism essentially was a long drawn-out civil war between these two groups of kingdoms. And after several centuries of war in the 2nd century of the First Era, the conflict was won by the Daedra worshippers, meaning that everywhere across the Ayleid Empire, the worship of the Daedra became legalized, and any resistance to the legalization ended when the conflict ended. However, after the final battle of the conflict near the Ayleid kingdom of Wendelbeck, some of the final Aedra worshipping holdouts were driven out of Cyrodiil and chose exile rather than accepting Daedra worship. They would settle on the border of Cyrodiil with Blackmarsh, founding cities like Stormhold and Gideon, and they founded a new civilization, the Barsaebic Ayleid civilization. Now, you may think that these Barsaebic Ayleids, being worshippers of the Aedra, were probably a peaceful and nice people, but no. They brought many proud Ayleid traditions with them, like violently driving out the native population, warring against the Argonians and the native human tribes. Oh yeah, and they also brought slavery with them, enslaving many of the locals to help build their cities and experiment on them magically, so yeah, they did Ayleid stuff, even if their religion was a bit different from their Heartland brethren nowadays. They were essentially, for all terms and purposes, a continuation of the Aedra-worshipping Ayleid kingdoms of the Heartland, and they were very much a separate entity from the Heartland Ayleid Empire at this time. For example, when the Alessian slave rebellion broke out in Cyrodiil against the Daedra-worshipping kingdoms, the Barsaebic Ayleids refused to send any aid in terms of reinforcements to help combat the rebelling slaves. and they even refused to harbor those Ayleid refugees who fled from the rebellion and later persecution in the Alessian Empire. And as such, the Barsaebic Ayleids were spared, at least initially, by the armies of Alessia, who did not invade their lands in the swamps, meaning that for several centuries after the start of the decline of the Ayleid culture in the Heartland, the Barsaebic Ayleids continued to somewhat thrive, expanding their territory to near the border with Cyrodiil, doing magical experiments, creating magical artifacts, doing experiments with necromancy and turning their kings into liches, you know, Ayleid stuff. However, unfortunately for them, their civilization did not last long either, as eventually the Barsaebic Ayleid realm also fell. Now, there isn't a lot of lore on what exactly caused their downfall, but what we do know is that near the end of their existence, the Barsaebic Ayleids were facing several issues. For example, they were losing battles against the Argonians and against the Alessian Order, the human supremacists who took power over the Alessian Empire sometime after Alessia's death, as they did start attacking the Barsaebic Ayleids eventually, and we also know that some of the Barsaebic kingdoms, particularly those where necromancy was heavily practiced and their kings were turned into liches, they also suffered from their own slave revolts, where their slaves rose up against them and started civil conflicts, so it's likely that they eventually fell to these combined factors, disappearing into the annals of history and eventually the ruins of their once great cities, being reused by other civilizations. And that is about all I can say about the elvish tribes of the swamps of Blackmarsh. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not give the video a like or one of those hype things. Also, for those interested, I put the final bit of stock on the merch website of the mini fan pack that I used to test the merch store for the 10-year anniversary that's coming up. So if you're interested in getting that, there's a link in the description to my merch store. Also in the description are links to other videos, like for example a link to the Ayleid Empire video that I mentioned if you want to hear the full story of the Narfinsel Schism and the entire Ayleid Empire, and also links to videos about some of the other cultures and races that I've talked about in this video, since there's a lot of subjects that we touched in this video but that I couldn't go into without severely going off message, so if you want to know more, there will be more videos in the description. And now it's time to end the video and thank my top Patreon subscribers. Goblark, Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Volcure of Argonia, RB Dash, Lexicon, Polycom, Sir Otter, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Spaceman, James Lynch, Baradermas, and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen who are my wonderful Patreon subscribers and YouTube members who keep this channel afloat and put me in the position to make these videos in the first place. So, huge thanks to them. And I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Hopefully next week. Bye bye.